Welcome everyone to another video. This one's about the GB News broadcast yesterday, the 30th of December, with Jim Dale, when we had the normal clash, as it were. In fact, GB News actually separated that particular clash off as a video. So on the train on the way back home, I saw there were over 400 comments on that video, on this clash. And I'm pleased to say that I mean this, over 99% were in support of my side. So that's very interesting to know how the public are feeling out there. I accept that GB News may be a more enlightened audience in a way, but the fact that it's over 99%, it's important to me, and I thank everyone for their support. Frustrating as always, but I'm trying to change things so that we get, a different format. I am working on this, but nevertheless I'm going to use this broadcast as a way of explaining numbers of things. So I'll be talking about Canadian forest fires, and I'll be talking about a new subject, which is the Indian Ocean dipole oscillation, and so on. It sounds complicated, but it's not. So let's get started on this. Well, if you want to watch the video uninterrupted, I'm putting a link into the GB News one, which they broadcast yesterday, and which has got all these comments and lots of views. And you can look at that and look at the comments. But I'm going to dissect immediately that one. So we're going to go in, stop, dissect, and carry on as we normally do. And in doing that, I think I'll introduce other subjects to reinforce everyone's arguments against the cult.
It's now time for Climate Control, where we unpick the latest stories relating to the debate around climate change. And today I'll be looking back at some of the major events in 2023. It's been apparently the hottest year in recorded history, with some scientists saying that humans are unable to deal with the climate crisis of their own making. So we've seen flash floods in Libya, killing more than 11,300 in a coastal city of Derma. Wildfires ripped across Europe and Hawaii, with thousands of people evacuated across countries. And of course, more close to home, Storm Garrett, which has been causing havoc across the UK. That's threatening nearly an 80 mph winds in the next few days. But with some lighters and arson equipment found in locations of the Mediterranean and bad weather given over Britain's winter months, I'm taking a deep dive into these climate disasters and asking lots of questions. So joining me to unpick, I've got Jim Dale, meteorologist and commentator, also Paul Burgess, a climate scientist. So I'm going to start with you, Jim Dale.
Yes.
OK, so I've been generous. I've talked about climate so-called catastrophes in 2023.
You've done my job for me, almost.
No, but they're open to discussion. So talk to me about some of the things that...
well, look, Nana, you could have gone on and on and named 100 different things that have happened and more across the globe. We often take our eyes away from the rest of the globe and only look at ourselves. But in this case, this has been a tumultuous year in terms of what's gone on, how it's gone on, the amount of people that have been affected by, not just in the UK. I think the UK is sometimes on the periphery of this, but the biggest one, I say the biggest one, sea surface temperatures, ice decreasing from Antarctic and Antarctic as well. But the disasters that you've already mentioned are the big ones. They're the ones that stand out. I've got a little piece from this morning's paper in The Guardian here. Climate disasters of 2023 reveal a failure to stem the crisis, experts say, which is precisely what you said on the intro. That's absolutely right. We've lost control.
Well, I balanced the intro, so you're talking as though I'm
just repeating what you basically said. But we've lost control.
Well, a number of things Jim said there I'd like to take issue with, but I'll start with this last one. We've lost control. We never had control. Let me tell you now that mankind has never had control of the climate, nor do we now have control of the climate. This idea that man had lost control because we have done naughty things to the climate and we've now lost the control we had is meaningless rubbish. No control ever existed. No control exists now. Of course, Jim goes on about individual weather events non-stop, so let me make this clear. All of last year's events are single points on a graph that requires hundreds of thousands of points. That's what climate is. It's not the single point, it's not weather. He still doesn't understand what climate science is. But an interesting comment came up in one of my videos recently. Very simple comment. It was to do with Gregory Whitehouse, the man that Jim said was living in a cave, that nobody had heard of at all. But the point he made in the comment was, given that he didn't know him, And given that no one had heard of him, how could he manage to call him a liar? Which is a pretty good point, really. It says it doesn't matter what evidence you present to Jim, he just blanks it. No matter what. IPC evidence, blank it. Environment agencies, both sides of the Atlantic, blank it. Met Office evidence, blank it. Royal Meteorological Society evidence, blank it. He never provides evidence back to counter it, by the way. So the point being made was that if this Jim Dale doesn't know this man, how did he manage to call him a liar? Anyway, I'll carry on with further points and dissect things now.
And to wrestle that back, I don't want to be completely negative, make that absolutely clear. There are things that we can be positive about. For example, today, another day, 40% of our energy came from wind, the number one top spot, and it has been for the last week or two all the way through.
Well, Jim, yes, the winds have been high for the last week or two, but it hasn't been like that all the way. Just look at this day here, where next to nothing happened in wind, and it had to be made up for by gas. And don't forget all the disruption to the entire gas supply and everything else that we've got to have as 100% backup to wind at any time. So when you add a 30 gigawatt wind farm, you've got to add 30 gigawatts of gas. Otherwise, you get nothing when there's no wind. And you can't run a modern economy on that. So what you've just said is just factually incorrect. There's the information from the grid. There's the date when it was next to nothing.
So I think that will increase. I think the renewables will increase. I think we've reached the top of fossil fuel emissions.
Well, that's the most ridiculous comment of all. It's delusional. The fact is that China and India, as we all know, are going into coal as fast as they can. The CO2 output of the world is growing and growing and growing, and it's good news, actually, I think, but it's growing. What we do to cut emissions make no difference at all to what's happening in the future. In fact, if they really believed in their witchcraft hype, they would know that in their world, the world's going to end. Because the facts are, we're making no difference to the CO2 output. The facts are, even though I'm in the minority, I know that because of the delusions of most people now and how they've been educated, the facts are, I'm going to have my way. I'm going to get the more CO2. So we are going to see the effect. I think what's going to happen now is we're going into cooling. I think the signs are all there for that. The natural cycles would indicate that. That we're heading now and we've started into a cooling period. Hard to believe, I know, but I think that's the case. So, but nevertheless, Jim here, praising that somehow we've made a difference, that just ignoring the CO2 output going up in the world and saying somehow our CO2 does more damage than theirs, is ridiculous.
I think they will start to decline in 2024. So that's the good news. The bad news is the catastrophes that we've seen this year will be repeated, not necessarily in the same places, but make this absolutely clear. They will happen worldwide.
No. This is a prediction. You're no soothsayer. I mean, come on. Look,
I'll be next year saying the same thing.
Okay, well, and maybe it won't have happened even then. I mean, that's the question. But with regard to Libya, right now, that was caused by a dam bursting.
Okay, so let me give you the fact. It was caused by two dams bursting, actually. But what was the causal effect? It was 8 inches of rain within a 24-hour period. Phenomenal amounts of rain. In other words,
so you're saying the dam bursting caused rain? What do you mean?
No. The rain aggregated 8 inches of rain in in fact, it wasn't 24 hours. It was actually 8 hours. 8 inches of rain falling is equivalent to, give or take, 4 months of London rain. In other words, in a few hours that landed, and that is what. The dams might not have been in the greatest.
They weren't maintained, were they? Had they been there?
Water in there
in a non-maintained dam, badly maintained dam.
Well, you saw what happened. You saw, and the headlines in some right-wing newspapers, The Sun, The Mail. Run for your life, all of this type of thing from the wildfires and other,
I need to bring it over to Paul Burgess because you said a few things. So your main things, just give me the first thing you talked about was this is the greatest year of climate change. Greatest year of climate change ever. Jim says it's the greatest year of climate change.
It's total nonsense. I mean, this is the Jim who promised you and me that he produced the evidence for more droughts when the IPC say there aren't any. And the IPC say there aren't any more floods as well, etc., as do the environment agencies from both sides of the Atlantic, etc. So I go on data here, right? So if you take the dam, and that's my speciality, as it were, that was a dam failure. What is a flood? It's too much water in a limited time. It's not water of a long time. And
And you can't get worse than a dam bursting for a flood, because you get a lot of water suddenly. That's what a flood is. And there's no evidence that Jim can produce, and I challenge him again now, because he never produces evidence. I challenge him to produce the evidence for increasing floods in the world, because if he does, he's gone against the IPCC, the Environment Agencies, the lot.
Look, I'm going to explain this intense rainfall. Now, Jim should know about this as a meteorologist, but he obviously doesn't. Intense rainfall, especially, nearer to the equator, it can be very intense. I think people who've been on holiday in Florida will suddenly find out how intense it can be even there. But in the Middle East, it can be extremely intense. And I've lived in the desert. In fact, once when I was working in the desert in Saudi Arabia, we camped in a trough. It was like a clay trough with a funnel coming out. We didn't understand what it was for. And it rained so intensely that we could see a river coming towards us from the mountains about a mile away. And we could actually see the beginning and end of the river. And it came towards us, crossed the desert and hit the trough. The trough was there to collect the water, but we soon found out that, we shouldn't have camped there. So let's now look at why you get intense rainfalls in this part of the world. And it's down to the Indian Ocean dipole oscillation. Dipole because, as you can see here from this diagram, one part of the ocean is warm, one part is cool, and they can swap around. So they swap around from cool to warm either side. And they can cause intense rainfalls on either side of that, depending on what's going on. And it's a well-known meteorological event. It's a well-known oceanic event. Well, this comes from the Royal Meteorological Society, Jim. You may have heard of them, and the link is given there for anyone to check it. What researchers will no doubt be looking at now is whether this extreme event is part of a long-term trend and whether it is linked to climate change. Unfortunately, the causes of the Indian Ocean's changing temperatures are largely unknown, so the secret of how our changing climate will affect it has yet to be revealed. So in other words, we have no clue as to how it is. It looks as if it's natural. Given that it's been going on for a long, long time, I guess it's natural, but we don't know. But what you cannot say is it's caused by climate change.
Next one, let's take tornadoes. As it happened, there's more tornadoes in the UK per square mile than there are in America. I didn't know this.
Number two, actually. Number two.
No, well, actually, you're going to disagree with David Schultz, who happens to be the professor. Can I do it without interruption?
Because we let you talk to me.
Professor of synoptic meteorology at the University of Manchester. He agrees with me. The tornadoes got nothing. Tornadoes happen. He had a PhD thesis on this, one of his students, and it works out that we get 2.3 in a unit area, 2.3 tornadoes a year, and America only gets 1.3.
Well, what about
tornadoes? And I've got data here. I actually handed one of them to show was worse than the past and the patterns. So tornadoes are nothing to do with climate as such.
What about the wildfires in Europe?
Right, let's take the wildfires in Europe then. Right, the wildfires in Europe, again, if you look, in wildfires in Europe, I have a chart here. I've got one here, which I gave to the producer.
Can we get the wildfires in Europe chart out?
No, the wildfire in Europe is here.
Oh, we haven't got it.
No, we've got it here.
Right. What does it all mean? They can't see that. So if you put that down and just describe it, tell us.
What? This is the European Environment Agency again. Yeah. I use data, yeah? And this doesn't show it. It shows a decline, if anything, of wildfires in Europe.
Yeah.
Well, this is that graph. I could only give 3 graphs to the producer beforehand, and I chose to give the global reduction in fires from NASA one, which shows a 24% reduction. But Nana asked me, she didn't understand that, and asked me to produce this one, which the producer did not have. But here it is. It shows the burnt area from forest fires for all the European countries, and it also shows the overall figure, which is the top curve, that sort of yellowish mustardy coloured curve. And as you can see, there's been a gradual reduction since the 1980s, although we did get a peak, not as high as 1985, but we did get a peak around about 2016-17. But there's no pattern there showing growing fires with climate, which is what they're going on about. If anything, it shows overall a reduction.
See, when you actually come to look at the data, when you're looking at climate, you've got to look at wildfires or floods, whatever it is, over a period of time. You haven't got any information. And I challenge you, because last time you said, and Nana repeated it, that you will produce the drought information, and you didn't.
It's not a case of coming on the thing with bits of paper, trying to flag them like you do, saying this is evidence, because most of the stuff you produce is bogus, to be frank with you. You've mentioned Europe. Europe had tremendous wildfires.
It's the Met Office.
Bear with me. Europe had tremendous wildfires, but you neglected to mention Canada, who had its worst wildfires ever.
No, I've actually got Canadian information.
Well, he said he's got the Canadian information.
New York.
Let's talk about the Canadian information, because he talked about Canada.
The smoke that went into New York, all of that sort of stuff.
So let him respond, because you've made a comment.
All the time. You don't even know what climate is. I'm sorry, I know you're a climate consultant, but you ought to know what it is. What it is, if you're going to look at wildfires in Canada, you've got to look over a period of time. And I didn't know I was going to be asked that. I've looked at it recently, and it's got less. So you can't... I'm sorry. When I present you with data, you never, ever present me with data back. Ever.
And this is Canadian forest fire graph. And the source is given there as well, so you can check it out. And as you can see, well, first I've explained the bar charts are the amount of acreage burned, and the top squiggly black line is the number of fires. So if you look, the worst were back in 1990s, mid-1990s were the worst, and then it declined and it pulsed up again and down, and it pulsed up again and down. But there's no correlation there whatsoever with rising CO2, and the number of fires has been decreasing over this time. You see, there is no evidence supporting the CO2 story, but there's no evidence anywhere with anything supporting the CO2 story. So this again is the official diagram. You can't just take 1 year. You really can't. You have to look at the pattern like this. So again and again and again, I try to bring Jim down to understanding what climate is and how science works. He doesn't understand either. So whilst we're at it, let's take a look at the latest data from the USA. 2023 US wildfire season sees the total acreage burned under 3 million, far below the 10-year average and the lowest since 1998. Well, would you believe that? And here is the data for it. The official data. So nothing is complying with the Jim hysterical stories, is it? No matter what you look at, whether you look at Europe, Canada or America. It doesn't matter. He is pure hype. All of this, he doesn't understand that what he is involved in is the political hype. You know, a political hype that totally ignores the huge amount of CO2 being put into the atmosphere in the Far East. That's not changing anything. It makes everything we do insignificant. Even if America disappeared off the map, it wouldn't make that much difference. CO2 would continue to grow and grow quite rapidly.
Right, that's all I can do.
Bogus rubbish.
But that's. I'm going to have to stop you there. Stuff. No. But he has pulled things off from the IPCC, and some of the things.
He's extrapolated little bits of the IPCC that don't count. You know what the IPCC is?
To you.
It's a 90-page report that basically backs up what NASA, NOAA, and other organisations have been saying since the year.
Produce it, because it's bogus.
I don't need to produce it.
No, you can't.
Coming on here with a scrap of paper trying to show it to radio listeners.
This is the Royal Meteorological Society on the African floods. This is the Royal Meteorological Society saying that there's no way you can attribute it to climate change.
Again, you're cherry-picking like crazy.
I'm not cherry-picking. I'm looking
absurd what you say. What you've got to do, if I can just say, what you've got to do with all of this is join the dots. Join the dots of all of the...
You live in one dot. You live in weather. I live in lots of dots.
No, you're a water resource engineer. You're not even a climatologist. So what? So
all right. Okay, well, hold on. No. As soon as you start doing that, I'm going to stop you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's. No. Neither of you should do that. So let's. Oh wait. What about Storm Garrett then, or Garrett? Jim, what is happening with this storm?
Yeah. Well, let's put it into context. Storms happen. They do happen, and it not necessarily climate related. You can't say every single event is a climate event, because that would be wrong. That would be absolutely wrong.
Well, that's some progress, because on the earlier programmes with me, he did claim that. He did claim there's, in each storm, in each event, there's an element of climate change that somehow magically you could find. But he's moved a bit. The only difference, well, what we disagree on there, is he said, you can't... No time can you say an individual event is climate. No time. And nor can you assess it afterwards. All you can assess is the overall picture. End of subject. But he has moved a bit now. He even told me in the green room after a few of them sessions. Oh, by the way, climate is joining the dots together. Exactly what I just told him on the show. He's amazing.
You've got to look after the event, maybe months and years. You've got to join these dots, but you can't say, Garrett, Garrett's climate change. What you've got to look at is what's in it, how it occurs, whether there are a procession of them.
Can you see how it's occurred now without?
Yeah, it's the jet stream. It's well, there's one connection to climate, and that is the ocean sea temperatures of the summer, autumn time. Extremely warm. Give it extra energy. That's easy science, isn't it? Very, very easy science, Paul, for you.
Let me say something here. The sea contains 1,000 times more heat than the atmosphere. The sea controls our climate.
Yes, it does. I would agree with you.
The oceans control our climate more. They've got 50 times more CO2 than the atmosphere. The ocean just murmuring causes problems. The El Nino, the La Nina.
Yep.
In the case of the African floods, and I've got it from the Royal Meteorological Society, that's not down to climate.
So what about Storm Garrett, though? We're talking about
Storm Garrett is just a normal storm.
Yeah.
There's nothing different about it. But let me explain something. As the tropics, all the cooling and warming of the Earth takes place from either side, the poles. It doesn't take place in the tropics. The tropics more or less stay the same. So as you differentiate between the centre, the tropics, and the north, as there's a bigger differential, you get more extreme weather. So when it's cooler in the north, now I'm going to just say something, Jim.
Briefly.
22nd of December, just past, was the biggest ice extent in the Arctic since 2009. I've just published the video.
Living in dream world somewhere.
Well, I'm living in...
You really are.
You
really are.
Well, instead of telling us living in dream world,
prove
what have
that
you got?
next week. I've made a statement. Prove it next week.
It just
I've
goes
done the
on
video.
and on and on. OK, let's just say,
the video's called
what's going to happen in 2024? El Nino is still running, climate change is still going. I've said about the positive things that are going to go on out there this year, hopefully. The negatives will continue. Watch the space, watch the disasters, OK? Because they will happen. That's my prediction.
He says, watch the space, watch the disasters, Jim Dale. Climate catastrophising.
I will now just expand a little on what I was trying to say there. First of all, you need to understand that weather is about difference. It's a difference between temperature or pressure in one place or another that causes us to feel the weather. It's the trying to balance things out all the time. That is weather. Rossby waves were discovered in 1946. They're the circumpolar vortex. Now, when you have little difference in the colder at the top, in the top of the globe there, when you have a small difference, you get these gentle Rossby waves. And as we know, our weather in the UK comes from the southwest. So it comes and we get, the weather. Right. But when it's colder up north, because the globe cools or warms always from the poles, the equator, the warm air tends to stay the same. And so when you get colder, you get a much bigger difference. And that causes these Rossby waves to be much deeper like this. Now, the problem is, as you can see with this arrow here, when the weather is coming, it can get blocked. It's coming from the southwest there. It meets this Rossby, and you can get stationary Rossby waves, almost stationary for long periods. So you can get long periods of wet floods and long periods of dry droughts. So you tend to get more extreme weather in the colder periods of the Earth. Now, even droughts are worse in colder periods. Now, this is a list of the worst droughts ranked by duration in British history. And as you can see, the very worst one was 1765 to 1768. That was a real cracker. We've had nothing like it since. But then I've just ruled out now the more modern droughts and going back to those cold times of the 1800s and early 1900s. You see, all of those worst droughts occurred in the colder atmosphere. And that is so true. The coldness brings more extremes because there's more difference between the tropical atmosphere and the polar atmosphere. And the more difference causes those deeper waves. It's as simple as that. But back to our video. Just when you think he may be beginning to understand it, he says things like that. Watch this space, watch for all the individual events, because that's what he lives off. He lives off panic and fear. And people who, like children, who don't know the history of climate. I mean, there was one famous saying that you will stay a child unless you learn history, because you won't get all the experiences in your life that history can give you. History is so important, especially in climate, as you can see. So if you were born 23 years ago, you've only known the climate since 2000, and they can scare you with things. That's what they're doing there. So this idea that we look forward, there's no individual weather event that can happen in the next year, this coming year. None can happen which can be attributed to climate. They can just contribute to a point on a graph to look at an overall picture. End of subject. Right. Where are we with Jim? I've really got to move the way this is happening on these debates, and I'm going to make a serious attempt to do so. That was the more time we had. We had 10 minutes that time. That's the biggest time we've ever had. My problem is that I can't produce all the data at the time. I produce it afterwards like this to get rid of my frustration. That's what it does. And that's all I can do. But I'm determined to get to the bottom of it. And I'm trying to get times on GBNews when I can actually spend 15 minutes explaining things, because I think that would really be beneficial. And I wouldn't mind if I had 15 minutes and Jim, or we had 5 minutes each and we could counter it over 30 minutes, say. That would be a good format. But that's what's needed, because I'm sitting there with hundreds of papers in a folder, but there's no chance of getting them out and explaining. So I have to sit there and absorb this rubbish all the time, trying to decide how many seconds have I got left, what's the most effective way to use that. That's my problem on the show. Getting back on the train with what was happening was also my problem, with cancellation after cancellation after cancellation. I managed to get home after running along the platform, was the last passenger on the last train, and them spotting me and just holding it back as I ran to get the train. I was the last passenger on it, then the door shut and I got home. Of course, the very last point that Jim made about, well, saying, what planet am I living on about the ice? I mean, I'm just going on the record from satellite observations of the ice from the official records. And I featured that particular story in my last video called A Christmas Miracle. The fact it's been so hot and we got more ice. So anyone who hasn't seen that should watch it, actually. It's only 2 minutes long, but it explains the madness of what we're being taught all the time. But it doesn't matter to Jim, me using the forestry official data, me using the Royal Meteorological Society data, me using the European environmental data. All that doesn't matter. Somehow I'm cherry, but he never explains why. He never says, this is the opposite. This is the evidence of the opposite. And the truth is, he can't, of course, because there isn't. Because I am telling the truth. And the truth will always win. And with that, I will say, cheerio till next time.